seem to have a fairly settled number of participants now, so can I welcome everybody to this seminar. I'm Professor John Denham. I'm the Director of the Centre for English Identity and Politics at Southampton University, and I'm hosting today. Most of you, I'm sure now, will be familiar with this, but a couple of points about Zoom. There's a Q&A, question and answer function on Zoom. If you want to put a question to the panel, then please put your question in there. You can also upvote or give your support to questions that other people have asked that you'd like to hear answered. So I'm going to be quite strongly guided by that when I come to pose questions. There is also a chat function, so you can exchange comments amongst yourselves during the seminar. I'm probably not going to check that so regularly, so if you want a question to be put to the panel, please put it under the Q&A. We've got a great panel of speakers to talk about constitutional futures. Carwyn Jones, member of the Senate, former First Minister for Wales, now at Aberystwyth University, is going to open the discussion. Nick Pearce, who's the Director of the Institute for Public Policy Research at Bath University, former Director of the Institute of Public Policy Research and Director of the No. 10 Policy Unit when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, and Professor Nicola McEwen, who is Professor of Territorial Politics at Edinburgh University, where she's also co-director of the Centre for Constitutional Change. Carwyn's going to set out his views. To make it interesting, I've asked Nick to reprise his role as a Downing Street head of policy. So what response he would be making to a Prime Minister, not necessarily Gordon Brown, in response to what Carwyn is going to propose. And I've asked Nicola to look at Carwyn's ideas in the context of the broader academic debate on which he is a considerable expert. If I can just briefly set the scene, I was a junior Labour minister in 1997 in Tony Blair's new Labour government. That was the government that introduced the initial stages of devolution to Wales and Scotland. I wasn't involved in those discussions, but I certainly was given the lines to take, as all ministers were. And the first line you always took was that nothing in this is going to change the sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament. That the powers that would be exercised in the Parliament, in Scotland, in the Assembly, now Senate, in Wales, were, as it were, being lent from Westminster, but they weren't being transferred from Westminster. So everything was going to change, but nothing was going to change. And it's probably, perhaps not a coincidence, that in the second reading of the Scotland bill, not a single Labour MP from England participated in any way whatsoever. Nothing was going to change. Well, 20 years later, rather more has changed than many people expected in those days, and the idea that nothing was going to change seems less likely. So it's probably a good time to revisit that most fundamental question of the original devolution settlement, the question of Westminster sovereignty. And that's what I've asked Carwyn to open the discussion and to talk about today. So over to you, Carwyn.
Thank you very much, John, and good afternoon, everybody. Pranam da Bawb, and thank you very much for attending this session today. As still a serving politician, certainly until the end of March in our Parliament, I've always been very much aware of the fact that politicians are very keen to drive the car, but not necessarily that interested in knowing what goes on underneath the bonnet, which is what we're looking at today. Now, how can the machine of the Constitution be made to work more effectively? I suppose in some ways, the current UK Constitution can be summed up in 3 sentences. Now, I can reach up above the shelves here and I can bring down for you a textbook on constitutional law. It's that thick. But in reality, it's 3 sentences, the UK Constitution. 1, there's a monarch whose powers are exercised through ministers of the Crown. 2, there's a Parliament at Westminster. 3, that Parliament can pass whatever laws it wishes without any kind of challenge. Lord Hailsham in the 70s described that system as an elective dictatorship. He forgot his views when he got into government in years subsequent. But the only break, according to constitutional theory on the Westminster Parliament, is an election every 5 years. That's pretty much it. Now, isn't that the kind of system we want in the future? Parliamentary sovereignty or supremacy, the words are used interchangeably, is based entirely, and I mean entirely, on the views of one man. In the 19th century, Professor Albert Venn Dicey of Oxford University, he was the first one to suggest that the UK Parliament was sovereign, but only in the context of England. there is an open question as to whether parliamentary sovereignty actually applies in Scotland. It was raised many years ago in a case called McCormick and Lord Advocate in 1953. It's never properly been settled, because when the UK Parliament was originally put together in 1707, it was silent as to which constitutional principles should apply, whether English principles or Scottish principles. And the Scottish constitutional principles were based on the sovereignty of the people, not on the sovereignty of Parliament. So it's all theory. It's a convention that the courts have recognised, although in recent years they began to question whether Parliament is absolutely sovereign, whether that's actually in keeping with democracy or indeed the rule of law. But there's no actual law that says that Parliament is sovereign, UK Parliament rather, is sovereign or supreme. But that's the way we've always operated. Now, if we take that to extremes, it means that the UK Parliament can do away with courts, remove any rights, imprison people at random, or even abolish elections. I use the word extreme there for those who've been in Westminster who are still there. I don't suggest that is about to happen, but in theory, it could happen. There are no constitutional safeguards against any of this. We talk about inherent individual rights. There aren't any in the UK. We have the Human Rights Act, but that's part of statute law. The UK Parliament could get rid of that when it wants and replace it with absolutely nothing at all. So we really have a situation where everything is at the whim of the UK Parliament. There are no constitutional safeguards at all in the way that we would see in other jurisdictions. Now, I have to say that if we'd had this seminar 7 or 8 years ago, we would all have been accused of being anoraks, and I would have been one of them. I'm glad to see that anoraks have become fashionable over the past 7 years, and perhaps the first thing to do is to analyse why that is the case. The UK is under strain. The UK has never faced such an existential crisis, really, as it faces now. We see in Scotland consistent opinion polls showing a clear majority in favour of independence. We see quite a significant growth in the independence movement in Wales, a long, long way short of the majority, but grown from about 10% to 30% of the electorate in not far short of 18 months. And of course, we see in Northern Ireland the rethinking in terms of what the relationship with Northern Ireland would be with the Republic. It's not about to rejoin the Republic, it's far more complicated than that. And somebody away from Belfast, I know that full well. But this is a challenge that the UK has not faced for 100 years, since Ireland, most of Ireland left, and it became the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This is also brought into sharper focus by the fact that we've left the European Union. We joined the EU, or the Common Market, as it was in 1973. The UK was a unitary state. There was but one government. There could be only one, if we look at the words we see in Highlander. The state was a unitary state. But now what we have is a state that's a kind of semi-federal pick and mix, but where the UK government, as John has already said, maintains a legal supremacy and the ability to legislate whenever it wants and ignore the Sewell Convention, for example, as well, if it wishes to. It is possible for the UK Parliament to abolish the devolved parliaments without any reference to the people of those parliaments nations. Highly unlikely, I know, but nevertheless possible. And we've seen this message of taking back control. That resonates with the SNP and Plaid Cymru as well. They will argue, well, taking back control is not just for Westminster. There wasn't an asterisk after the phrase saying does not apply in Scotland and Wales. And they will argue that the same must apply for Scotland and Wales. It's not my argument, but nevertheless, it's one that we increasingly see in Wales. I think we are in real danger of seeing a UK that no longer exists in a decade unless we start to think about radical change now. We can't allow the debate, to my mind, to focus around either A, the status quo, or B, independence. And that's why it's important to develop other alternatives so that people can see what they look like and see whether or not they wish to offer them support. The fundamental difficulty now with devolution after 20 years is that devolution, in effect, was designed to give powers, lend powers, John is right, to the Celts. It was done in a very asymmetrical way. So when we started in 1999 in what was then the National Assembly for Wales, we had no primary lawmaking powers, for example, where Scotland did and Northern Ireland did. That's changed over time. We now have a tax-varying lawmaking parliament, but there's that asymmetry there. Justice isn't devolved in Wales, for example. In Northern Ireland, there's extensive devolution in terms of driver and vehicle licensing, employment law, So there's no symmetry there in terms of the devolution settlements. It's a bit like having a house and then building different sized extensions around the house without reflecting on what that means for the house as a whole. And for me, the time has come now to look at the Constitution as a whole. How does it work across the whole of the UK? How does it work for England? How does it work for everybody who lives within the jurisdiction of the UK, rather than thinking, if we give this to Scotland, that'll work in Scotland, but we won't give that to Wales, and that might go, it's just a jumble. And perhaps now is the time for clarity. Now, I have a particular view on how we might resolve this. It's radical, I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but it's not without precedent, either elsewhere in the Commonwealth or indeed elsewhere in the world. I can't see how we can continue without a written constitution. We don't have a constitution. We have a series of conventions that can be ignored. And that, I don't think, is suitable for a 21st century state, especially one that's coming under pressure as the UK is now. If unwritten constitutions were so marvellous, then they would be prevalent across the world. They're not. And indeed, Commonwealth countries have written constitutions as a rule, because they know that gives them certainty. We need a constitution that guarantees fundamental rights as part of a constitution that cannot be touched by a legislature, and, to my mind, gives the courts the power to strike down acts of unconstitutionality. At the moment, what we have is a UK Parliament that can effectively operate as it wants for 5 years based on the support of a minority of the electorate. And that, to me, is pushing the boundaries in terms of saying that we are an open democracy where there is a balance of power. And to me, that means that we must recognise that the UK consists of 4 nations coming together for a greater enterprise, and that is the UK. There are many good things about the UK that we need to keep, to my mind, which is why I'm not a supporter of independence. But that needs to be reflected in the Constitution. The first thing for me that needs to be done is that we recognise that there are 4 nations, and each of those nations has their own inherent sovereignty. Does that mean independence? Well, no, it doesn't, because if we look at the US, each state within the US is sovereign, and whatever, and there are reserved powers that are held effectively by the US Congress. In Canada, sovereignty is pooled between the provinces and the federal government. These are not radical ideas. These are ideas that are adopted as normal in many, many other countries. So it would be a question of there being a parliament each in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and then an agreement that each of those parliaments holds identical powers, so symmetrical sovereignty, if I can put it that way. But importantly, that each nation agrees there are some areas where sovereignty should be shared for the good of all. And that means creating effectively a federal parliament, which would represent the whole of the UK and would deal with those issues that are specifically within the province of that parliament. What might they be? There might be defence, of course. They might be borders and immigration control. And of course, the fiscal and monetary union. That one of the great strengths of the UK is that it's not ideal because the Barnett formula is A, outdated. There'll be other views on that, of course, and B, can be ignored at will by the Treasury. But nevertheless, there's clearly a mechanism there where money is distributed to where it's most needed. And that is a great strength of the UK that I believe we need to preserve. So it would be for each nation to decide how that sovereignty is shared, and that shared sovereignty would be expressed through a federal parliament and, if you like, a federal government. There doesn't have to be a supreme legislature that sits above all others, as long as you are clear where powers lie. That's exactly what happens in the States. It's exactly what happens in Canada. And to my mind, you can't do that without a written constitution, because otherwise you still keep parliamentary sovereignty and parliamentary supremacy. Both, let's say, terms are interchangeable, which does not support equality in terms of the equality between parliaments. This, of course, some of you will have noticed, ignores the question of English devolution. And to my mind, it's a separate issue. Either we have a system where there's asymmetrical devolution across the whole of the UK. So I don't think people in the North of England would argue they want a tax-varying lawmaking parliament. Some might, but some not. My answer would be, it would be a matter for the English Parliament to decide how devolution operates within England and how power is dissipated within England itself. So that will be a matter for the English Parliament to decide, and that will be a matter for decision further on down the line. Some have said to me, well, what happens then with the confederal parliament? Doesn't that just mean that it's, because England's so big, that it becomes effectively a second English Parliament, I'd say, well, okay, the way you balance that out is to have a hybrid system of representation there. A mix of what we see in the States between the Senate and the US House of Representatives, where some are elected on a population basis and some on a territorial basis, to create that level of greater balance, whilst recognising England's sheer size and the fact that you could not have a situation where, if Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland did one thing, that would automatically overrule England at every single time, whether at governmental level or at legislative level. It would also, and I can see the time, it would also be hugely important to have proper intergovernmental machinery in place. Now, we have at the moment the Joint Ministerial Council. I can tell you from many years of experience that it basically is a place of argument. We used to meet once a year in plenary, all the heads of government, and it would be a place where grievances would be outlined and sage nods and acknowledgement given to those grievances. It didn't do anything. There was no mechanism of joint decision-making, and that's the weakness we've seen with COVID. There's no formal, proper decision-making process where all governments can agree on a common way forward, and that's been a weakness for us. And of course, although we have a dispute resolution process as part of the JMC structure, every single dispute is resolved by the UK government. So if you have a dispute with the UK government, the dispute is resolved by the UK government. And a classic example for me was the £1 billion that was given to Northern Ireland as part of the deal between Theresa May and the DUP. I'm not going to argue against that, but a good third of that money should have been ballotised. It was for health and education. We raised the issue, ourselves and the Scottish Government raised the issue as a dispute with the UK government as part of the formal dispute resolution process. And the Treasury's response was, we don't accept there's a dispute. So we couldn't even start the process because the UK government had a veto over whether there was a dispute at all, and then decided the dispute in any event, even though it was a party to that dispute. No, there's no fairness in that, clearly, and that's something that we need to change in the future. Now, I've gone on for longer, I know, John, and I should have done it at the start. I could give you a long lecture on constitutional law. You'll be relieved, mightily relieved that I'm not going to do that, but obviously looking forward to hearing other people's views. Thank you.
You were very succinct, but you clearly laid out a radical vision of a different way of approaching the union. So I think the main points were very, very clear there. Thank you very much. Can I go straight to Nick Pearce for a response? Nick.
Great. Thanks very much, John. And thank you, Carwyn, for those thoughts. It is indeed a radical set of proposals that Carwyn makes. John asked me, as he said at the beginning, to respond rather as if I had the hat on of the head of the number 10 policy unit, as I did under Gordon Brown. And people may recall, actually, that when Gordon Brown became Prime Minister in 2007, he stated his support for commitment to a written constitution and to processes of constitutional change. Unfortunately, a financial crisis came along, a global recession, and within, of course, a few years, Labour lost power, and those processes of constitutional reform and change didn't amount to very much. They didn't go very far, leave much of a legacy. And I think one of the issues that raises is, at what point do you get the kind of constitutional change of the radical nature that Carwyn is talking about happening in countries like the UK? And when you're the head of a policy unit, you're not there simply to give technocratic advice to prime ministers. There are civil servants, there are constitutional lawyers, there are legal advisors, and others with expertise in constitutional law, in fiscal policy, in the relations between levels of government and so on. They, of course, all provide that advice, but these issues are intensely political. And one of the jobs of a head of a policy unit is to think about the politics of these questions as much as the substance. And when you think about the politics of this, of course, it's immediately apparent that when you go through a radical change of the kind that Carwyn is proposing, typically these sorts of changes happen as a consequence of war, as a consequence of revolution or civil war. Carwyn made reference to the Irish War of Independence. The last big constitutional change for the United Kingdom, as was the Union of Great Britain and Ireland, happened as a consequence of decades of conflict, the breakdown of consensus over home rule, First World War, Easter Rising, and so on, precipitating, those major changes. And when you look at other federal states with written constitutions in particular, they tend to be formed on the basis of revolution, as in the case of the US, or war, as in the case of the Federal Republic of Germany, or in the case of places like Canada and Australia, colonies coming together to form a union from what were previous separate states. So for us, what are the kind of political drivers of such radical change? If we were thinking about the politics of this question, well, as Carwyn mentioned, I mean, the main driver of discussion about these issues currently in the United Kingdom is Scottish nationalism and the rise and success of Scottish nationalism. And although support for Welsh independence has been rising, the proximate cause for all of these discussions about constitutional conventions and change has been the success of the SNP. And that indeed has given a certain character to the proposals that have come forward for refounding the Union. They're often driven by the need to understand Scotland's place in the Union, to understand how to keep Scotland in the Union. And that gives a certain kind of character to many of the proposals that follow. So thinking about the politics of the immediate period then, well, of course, the SNP could win a majority in the elections later this year, seek to hold a referendum, and that referendum, if it took place, could lead to independence. If that were the case, then the kind of reform process that Carwyn is talking about would necessarily have to take place, it seems to me. The rest of the United Kingdom would have to go through a process of examining how it would be constitutionally refounded. If the SNP is able to secure a referendum and there is a narrow victory for Scotland staying in the United Kingdom, then again, you can imagine processes of constitutional reform flowing from that, rather as the vow did just before the last independence referendum in Scotland in 2014, in the week before the referendum, a vow that there would be further change, and then the commission that followed that referendum. And of course, the final process, I suppose, politically that might change things is if the Westminster government refuses a second referendum, refuses a majority SNP government in Holyrood a second referendum, and decides to create some kind of alternative process for reconfiguring the Union, and may decide to engage upon some kind of more fundamental reform. Not easy for Conservative governments to do, considerable reluctance to engage in constitutional re-engineering amongst Conservatives for all sorts of reasons, philosophical, political, historical. But there could be an alternative process that then generated the kind of discussion about the things that Carwyn has raised. And there it seems to me you've got sort of two choices. One is to do that as an elite process, rather like the Royal Commission formed in the late 1960s, reported in 1973, which was a Royal Commission on the Constitution, created rather in response to victories in by-elections by Plaid and the SNP in the 1960s, and leading to proposals for devolution, which, as we know, then fell in the late 1970s. Or there could be a much more democratic process take place, rather like the kinds of ideas for constitutional conventions that people have been discussing recently, where you have a much more concerted effort to engage the peoples of the different nations of the United Kingdom in a constitutional debate. And there we do actually have a lot more evidence now from things like citizens' assemblies that have taken place in places like Canada, but more recently in countries around Europe. There's been one in Scotland recently, there's been one on climate in the UK. France is engaging in citizens' assemblies, and perhaps the most notable example, the Citizens' Assembly in the Republic of Ireland, which was asked to look at the question of the Constitution and the constitutional prohibition on abortion, recommended change. That went to a referendum which endorsed the change, and then the Irish Parliament legislated for it. So there is good evidence now and good experience of much more democratic methods of approaching these big constitutional questions that we could draw on. And if I were advising a prime minister, I would advise precisely that kind of process. Now, just quickly, in the time I have left, what issues would you examine and seek to resolve? Well, the first thing is the question of whether you want to move from a unitary state with devolution or a hybrid state to a federation. I think Carwyn's presentation talked about sovereign states confederating powers. I think that's unlikely myself that we would go from a United Kingdom to 4 sovereign states choosing to confederate. A federation, which is of course what we have in the US and Canada and so on, specifies the powers held at different levels and it codifies those in a constitution, but it's a federation rather than a confederation. And if we were to move to some kind of a federal system in the United Kingdom, at which you had a federal parliament, a federal executive, a Supreme Court, and then you had states which held powers which were codified and written down in a constitution. If you were to move to that kind of federal arrangement for the United Kingdom with a written constitution, the big question would be the nationhood of England, as John has raised over a number of years in his work, as Carwyn raised. Who would be the units that would be federated? What would be the states? And in the 1973 Royal Commission, there was a minority report arguing for English regions to have that role. And most proposals that come out of debates about the future of the UK from a Scottish perspective assume that English regions would be the counterparts to Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. I personally think that is a mistake. I think the English nation would need to be a co-signatory to or if not a co-signatory, sorry, a constituent part of a federal United Kingdom, and then it would need to work out its arrangements for devolution within England. And of course, there's an issue here for Wales too, because although Wales has a parliament and a government, it is still incorporated into the English nation by virtue of Henry VIII's legislation, 16th century legislation. So it's not a principality, as some people contentiously have suggested in recent years, but it needs to be given the status of a nation state within a federal arrangement. And Scotland, as Carwyn said, I think there's a very interesting question about whether the 1707 Act of Union actually was a founding treaty rather than, as some people have sometimes assumed, that it's simply the incorporation into the English Parliament of the Scottish Parliament. But Indy Ref 1, the first independence referendum, certainly, as it were, established, I think, certainly in the minds of the Scottish people, that they had the sovereign right to decide their future. Northern Ireland is more complicated by virtue of the Brexit Protocol, by virtue of the Good Friday Agreement, by virtue of the fact that, that any constitutional reworking for the United Kingdom would need to take particular cognizance of all of those special political and legal circumstances in Northern Ireland, which are distinct and different from those in Wales, Scotland, and England, and are enormously politically complicated. And there are international obligations at work there. Even though the government in recent months sought to abrogate international obligations, we do have now treaty obligations and obligations to the people of Northern Ireland, which make the idea that we can engage in a process of federal reworking of the United Kingdom, which treats Northern Ireland as simply a constituent part akin to the others, both implausible, illegal, and undemocratic. So where might that lead us if we were thinking then of the actual areas for change? Well, just to finish on these, of course, you could imagine a process of a constitutional convention leading to incremental changes too. You might approach this in a way that led to certain kinds of changes. So Carwyn mentioned an elected Senate of the nations. You might have a replacement for the House of Lords, which had nominated members on the basis of England, Wales, Northern Ireland, perhaps of English local governments. You might have a combination of population and nomination to constitute that Senate. That would be a big issue for discussion, and one that would pick up the threads of a lot of recent debate about reforming the House of Lords. You'd have to address this English question, as I say, whether it constitutes a nation and how it relates to its own processes of devolution. There is the fiscal question, that whether you replace the Barnett formula with a needs formula. If you were in the Treasury, you would be precisely seeking to do that. And of course, that raises very difficult political questions in Scotland, where the Barnett formula has seemed to be sacrosanct. But nonetheless, if I were advising a Prime Minister on these questions, I would be looking to move over time, slowly, and in an incremental fashion towards a new needs-based formula for the United Kingdom. You've got the question of dispute resolution, and the question then about whether, if you took those sorts of steps, it were possible to codify them into something which then formed a written constitution for a new federal United Kingdom. Those steps themselves might be taken along a path towards something which, as you got to it, was codified in a final settlement. So politically, there are different ways of getting to that point. Nonetheless, the same sorts of questions need to be addressed. But as I said at the beginning, this is not a technocratic exercise. It's a deeply political one that goes to the heart of who we are as a people. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. A bit more than just saying that would be a brave move, Prime Minister. So a lot of the key issues there. Can we go now, please, to Nicola? Nicola.
Yep, thanks. Thank you very much for the invitation to come along. I'm deeply honoured to be part of this panel. And I agree with much of what has been said so far, particularly in relation to the diagnosis of the problem. In terms of the state of play, I share Carwyn's view, and I think to a certain extent coming from Nick as well, of the fragile state of the UK's territorial constitution. All is not well at the moment. And I don't think all of that is about Brexit. Some of the flaws certainly predate Brexit. From the very beginning, there was a focus both from the government of the day and also from those who were advocating for devolution, a focus on the powers to be devolved, on the self-government aspects, on the self-rule, without really thinking through properly the mechanisms that might support coordination and communication, and perhaps even co-decision between the different governments that were being established by devolution. But I think there's also been a cultural issue, particularly in Westminster and Whitehall, where devolution has been conceived as being something that happened in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, rather than something that happened to the UK and to the UK as a whole. So there's been a reluctance to reform the way that the UK government does its business, the UK Parliament even does its business as the centre of a devolved, decentralised union state. That being said, there's no doubt that Brexit has exposed the weaknesses that were already there and exacerbated them. It's made it clear how the decisions taken by the UK government affect the competences and the responsibilities of the devolved institutions. And although some forums were created, like the Joint Ministerial Committee for EU negotiations, that was a body that was created after the Brexit referendum in order to facilitate the kind of cooperation, in order to, according to its remit, to try to reach a common UK approach to Brexit. That was the initial intention. In practice, it turned out that the devolved governments had very little influence over the Brexit process, and there was clearly a difference in view between the devolved institutions on the one hand, the UK government on the other, about the kind of role that they ought to have in shaping issues like Brexit negotiations, like trade deals, and so on. And the result of all of that has been that there are now exceptionally low levels of trust between the UK government and the devolved institutions. And that's not just about Scotland and not just about the SNP. I think the relationships have deteriorated quite significantly, and perhaps that's epitomised by the ease with which the Sewell Convention has been set aside by the UK Parliament. The Sewell Convention being, of course, the convention that the UK Parliament, although it is sovereign and remains sovereign, will voluntarily constrain its sovereignty by not legislating on devolved matters without the consent of the devolved institutions. Now, that was set aside in the case of Scotland over the EU Withdrawal Act. It was set aside in the case of all three legislatures in the case of the Withdrawal Agreement Act. And most significantly of all, it was set aside over the Internal Market Act that was passed in December. Now, the reason why I say that one is the most significant of all is because the central purpose of the Internal Market Act has been to change the way that devolution operates, to diminish, and with the effect of diminishing the authority of the devolved institutions. So what is to be done? Well, Carwyn talked about a written constitution or a codified constitution. And to be honest, I've always been a little bit ambivalent about that. My instinctive reaction is to say, well, it depends on what's in it. If it was a written constitution that codified and enshrined parliamentary sovereignty, then it's not really going to take us very far. I mean, clearly there are disadvantages in not having the kind of constitutional safeguards that Carwyn was talking about in a codified constitution, but at the same time, I think there are certain strengths in having the flexibility that the UK constitutional arrangements have demonstrated to adapt to circumstances as they change, to introduce constitutional changes as and when necessary. So I'm not convinced that the problem is the result of an unwritten constitution. I think the problem is a result of a lack of political will or a lack of shared understanding about what the UK is and how its constituent territories should relate to each other. Carwyn also talked about having a more symmetrical system. And again, I'm not convinced that asymmetry is the main source of the problem. In fact, asymmetry can allow a flexible response to different sets of demands. I appreciate that the hodgepodge is problematic to some extent, but I don't see that we would be likely to have a lasting settlement if we try to design a one-size-fits-all type of constitutional arrangements. And indeed, I think one of the strengths of the devolution arrangements that we have had have been their adaptability. To quote Ron Davies, devolution really has been a process and not an event, and that has helped certainly in Wales. It's helped in Scotland with each revision to the devolution settlements, even if each time that happens, the architects of the new settlement often think of it sincerely as the last one and the lasting settlement, and built to last, I think was the phrase that David Cameron used in the last round of settlements. But it's okay, I think, for the constitutional arrangements to be flexible and to adapt and to be a living, breathing thing that change in light of circumstances, in light of experience. So I think that's okay. Of course, now where asymmetry is a problem is in the issue of England, and what about England? And perhaps in terms of the arrangements within England, maybe they are a separate issue, but there is clearly a growing sense of dissatisfaction at the way that England is governed in all of these arrangements. My colleagues in Cardiff and in Edinburgh have over the years been conducting the Future of England survey, which has identified a growing sense of unease, a growing sense of grievance, a growing sense of English identity. And that, I think, does need to be addressed in some way. And I do think that the failure to address the governing of England as England is a barrier to creating the kind of co-governance model that Carwyn and his colleagues in the Welsh Government have long since advocated. My final set of comments is around the issue of consent. Now, there probably are constitutional options that could achieve the consent from all parts of the United Kingdom, including Scotland, but I do not see how that would happen before a new independence referendum. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that independence is inevitable. I am not advocating it. I am not opposing it. But it's clear that there is now sustained support for independence. There has been in every opinion poll conducted by a wide range of pollsters since last June, I think it is. And you can't keep a territory happily inside of the UK and secure a happy constitutional outcome without the consent of all of those territories. And I do think that that has to be tested again before we're likely to have a revised constitutional arrangement that will be something that sustains at least for a little while. Any federal system is about balancing unity and diversity. Even any federal type system, confederation, federation, or something in between. But all of them rely on a commitment to living together within the same state. And that isn't evident within Scotland just now, and it wouldn't be evident this side of a referendum. Now, of course, there's the order of events that you might think about, the sequencing of events that Nick spoke about towards the end of his contribution. And it's possible, entirely possible, that you could have an alternative offer as part of a constitutional referendum in Scotland. It would certainly help to make the issue less polarising. But I just don't see how ignoring the fact that there is majority support for independence in Scotland will help you to reach a federal type of arrangement that will secure the consent that Scotland, that it would depend on to be workable. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nicholas. Again, some really perceptive observations there. As I said at the beginning, I'm generally going to manage the questions myself rather than bring people in, because it's simply simpler with the technology. However, we do have Rachel Reeves, who's the Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office, who's joined the panel today. So I'm hoping I'm going to be able to bring Rachel in now as a panelist, if I can get this to work properly, and that Rachel is going to be able to join us. I seem to have brought Ray Nixon in by mistake. Apologies, Ray, but we've got Rachel there. Hi, Rachel. You obviously have a role in relation to Labour's proposed constitutional commission. It'd be interesting to hear any reflections you've got on the contributions you've heard so far.
Yes, thanks very much, John, for inviting me along today. It's been really interesting and thought-provoking. So thank you to Carwyn and Nick and Nicola as well for their contributions. John, you often say to me that Labour doesn't talk enough about the achievements from our time in office, including on these constitutional issues, devolution, the Good Friday agreement, etc. And I think you're right on that. We do also need to face up to the challenges that we face and the deficiencies in the model that we've got now. And as you'll know, remember, one of Keir's pledges in the leadership campaign was to have a constitutional convention. That's quite hard from opposition, as all of you have been in government will know. But Keir made a really good speech, I think, back in December at Glasgow University, setting out what he wants that commission and convention to look like. There'll be some announcements about that in the coming weeks, and just to sort of make this offer to all of you who are interested in these areas and can contribute. We really want that to be consultative and to involve all of the experts that are here today, but also very much to go out to the public with either citizens' assemblies or forums, etc., to bring people in, and not just on the sort of dry issues, because I think it was Carwyn who said at the beginning the sort of anoraks, but to ask the question more widely about what sort of country and society do we want to rebuild from the virus, what lessons have we learned, and certainly within England. And I think that, you know, it's easy to talk about constitutional reform and just talk about Scotland and Wales, and obviously we need settlements that work for all of our nations, but England's in a right mess as well. And I think Andy Burnham really encapsulated that during many periods last year, when the government in Westminster were imposing things on parts of the country that also felt very disconnected from what's going on in Westminster. I don't think it's a bad thing to actually draw those parallels between Wales, Scotland, and the regions of England, who I think actually have a lot of grievances in common, and there's a wider issue in England as well, and John knows this very much about where power lies. So certainly on the Constitutional Convention, we've got some more work to do, but we very much want to bring all of you into that, and we'll be in touch sort of in due course on that, and also thoughts on about how we can make it as wide and broad as possible, so that it isn't just a conversation, Carwyn, between the ANARACs, but it's a broader one as well. Just a couple of questions from me. Well, one of the things I've been sort of pondering is how do we tell a story about our United Kingdom, about our shared values, about what we have in common, that means it makes sense to be part of a wider union. And you know, quite often it's easy for politicians and policymakers to talk about the practical benefits of the union, around currency, around shared institutions, etc. And those are important points, because you know, they really matter to people's everyday lives. But there's also this issue about what binds us together as different nations, but part of one union. And how can we better tell that story? And how important is that for winning those arguments, particularly in Scotland, but also in Wales as well? And I guess the other question that I'd like to put to the panel is, you know, what can we learn from Labour's last period in office about what works and what doesn't work? You know, there was a drive, and many of you will remember this from your experience in government, to have greater devolution with England, with the North East Assembly, but it didn't win public backing. When we created mayors, I think a monkey got elected in Hartlepool the first time. People didn't take it seriously, just thought it was, you know, a bit of a joke, and additional layers of government and bureaucracy. So what worked, but also what didn't work, and what lessons can we learn from that if we wanted to do radical things under a next Labour government? Thanks very much, John. I really appreciate you bringing me in and being able to be part of today's session.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And I'll certainly make sure we cover both of those questions in the Q&A session we have now. We're getting quite a lot of questions coming in, but please do add more, and then I'll try and group them together to put them collectively on your behalf. But can we just start with a quick round of the panel to answer Rachel's first question, because there has sort of been an underlying assumption that the union is worth having. And it is quite interesting just to get from Carwyn and others what the core argument is about why, you know, if you take the view that the union was formed at a time that we were developing an empire, and then it was quite strong after the Second World War, but things have changed, perhaps you shouldn't take it for granted. So Carwyn, with you first, what is the key killing argument in favour of the union?
A sense of common endeavour. I think one of the problems we have now with British identity is that there are too many people who have tried to portray that as meaning, you know, flag waving, monoculturalism. Now, I grew up as a Welsh speaker, originally from a Welsh speaking village, and Britishness didn't mean very much to me, because Britishness was just, it was Englishness with stilts on, really. And I'd be hostile to the idea, of course. But for a lot of young people, particularly in Wales now, they don't feel particularly British. They don't see what that gives them as an identity. They're not hostile to the idea, but they're lukewarm. And British identity has never been weaker in Wales than it is now. There are still many people who feel it, of course. But what you tend to find politically is that the more British people feel, the more likely they are to vote Conservative. So if somebody had a Union Jack outside their house in Wales, you would automatically assume that they were a Conservative voter. And that's bad news, because that's not an inclusive view of Britishness. I think part of the problem is that, especially at the end of the 70s, the British state provided so much more for people. One of the reasons why devolution failed in Wales in 79 quite strongly in the referendum was that many people were employed by the British state. The British Steel Corporation, the NCB, the British state was seen as benevolent, redistributive, interventionist in a positive way. All that was lost in the 80s, and it was lost in the 90s. So the loyalty to the state as a provider of services has disappeared, you know, or diminished as a result of that. So I think we do have to make the case for the union. We have to remember, the British Union is like the European Union in some ways, not in every way. It's much stronger, much closer, much more greater cultural ties. But it is, at the end of the day, a union of nations. And the case always has to be made for it to exist. And that's what today's about, to my mind. It's not a question of things have to stay as they are, or there must be independence. And I take Nicola's view. I don't know the answer, frankly, as to whether this is too late, given Scotland's situation. But what we've never done, I know Gordon tried, he tried to do this in his latter years as Prime Minister, is define what Britishness means. So my view, you start off by saying it's a common endeavour. It's a union that delivers where help is needed the most. That's a start. You can build on that.
Okay, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important question because, as you intimated, John, the things that held the UK together, empire, and then the post-war world of nationalised industries and particularly class solidarities, that meant that the idea that you had a national identity that was distinct from Britain was much less sort of prevalent. Those things have gone. And I think one of the problems for the Labour Party in particular is that it has assumed that class solidarity can still pertain across the United Kingdom, even in post-industrial conditions, and has also assumed that issues of national belonging and national identity and demands for power and sovereignty can be subsumed behind where you position yourself on a left-right spectrum on the economy. And that essentially was the kind of Corbynite answer to this, that these things go away if you've got a radical enough economic agenda to appeal to people's interests. And clearly that doesn't work. I suppose my answer to Rachel's question would be that I think you do have to have questions of power at the heart of your response, that people aren't simply asking for reasons to stay in a union, they're asking to express and hold power. And so you have to think about how the union embodies a democracy and a democracy of constituent parts. That's one question. The second is also that it has to assume that, you can be Welsh and a member of the union rather than saying you're British, or you can be English and a member of the union rather than saying the primary identity you have is British. And I think that was something that we saw in Scotland, certainly before 2014, was a sense amongst unionists that the argument wasn't, how do you defend Britain? The argument was, why should it be a patriotic Scottish thing to be within the union still? And historians like Colin Kidd and others have written very importantly on there being a kind of a unionist nationalism in Scotland in its history. So I think for one of our challenges is then to think about how we can make the union appeal to the English, to the Welsh, to the Scottish, and in a different way in Northern Ireland, and to think about common endeavour in that context. And I rather agree with Carwyn that, probably, I mean, this is a difficult question, but probably the way that we will think about a union will of course be because it makes sense for us not to have internal borders, to have a shared currency, all the things that, a pooling of resources, pensions and so on, but also that there are things in the world that we want to achieve together. Climate change, development, reducing poverty. There are things that express a sense of aspiration for a better world. It isn't going back to a kind of class identity, but is saying that our common endeavour on these big challenges in the world is best done together. So something of that kind would be my answer, but it's incredibly difficult, and it's very difficult when you've got the integrative role played by political parties. Labour and the Conservatives and the Liberals were national parties across the multinational United Kingdom. And when that no longer pertains in the same way, and you've got parties that don't support that integrative function, again, it's very difficult to mobilise sentiments into politics in those circumstances.
Thank you, Nick. And I'm glad you mentioned the case for the union in England there, because one of the things I often find in these discussions is that a lot of people in Wales and Scotland assume that the union works for England, and that somehow the problem of the union is whether it works for the other parts of the union. Whereas there's fairly substantial polling evidence, not that there's a big movement for independence in England, because there isn't, but quite a low level of deep commitment to the union and a willingness, and we saw this in all the Brexit polling, but it's been there for 10 years or more, to see the union break up if England has its own interests. So the case certainly has to be made in England as well as elsewhere. Nicola, rather than bring you on this one, if I can, looking down the questions, quite a lot has been raised about the Conservative role in this debate, whether this requires the Conservatives if you like, to come onto the same territory of having a constitutional debate, which is clearly not where Boris Johnson is at the moment. So it'd be very interesting to have your views on whether the more muscular unionism that we're seeing from Boris Johnson has any chance of succeeding, however you measure that, presumably by the SNP losing an independence, or that the SNP and the Greens are losing an independence referendum, or whether the Conservatives may inevitably not have to come back into this debate about a different future for the Union. Do you have thoughts on that?
Sure. And I'm not entirely sure to whom the muscular unionism is directed. I mean, Prime Minister is clearly speaking to different audiences and different constituencies. But thinking about it from a Scottish perspective, well, it doesn't appear to be working. There's not a sign of a Conservative resurgence on the back of that. And I think one of the issues with the way that the debate around independence has developed is that it's become quite polarized between independence or this union, and it's crowded out the space in between. And there is a risk, I think, that the sort of more what you call muscular unionism, if it is seen to undermine the authority of the devolved institutions, then risks alienating that group that we might think of as in the middle, for whom self-government was an important achievement, but they might be not quite convinced or not have the same strength of feeling or commitment to independence as an outcome. But so I think there are particular risks in that kind of territorial strategy, but I agree it does appear to be the one that's there. And of course, there are opportunities for other parties to step up and step in, and the Constitutional Commission appears to be one possible avenue to that. But I think it's I suppose if a lot of Labour politicians here, and I suppose I would want to encourage recognition that the constitutional issue is important, and it is linked to all of those other issues, the social and economic issues that certainly Labour in Scotland gives the impression of really wanting to talk about instead of the constitution. They are now bound up quite closely together.
Thank you. A number of people, Roy Perry amongst others on the question and answer, had put in a sense the sort of question that Nick put in his opening thing, which was that normally you get a rewriting of a constitution after you've been defeated in a war, you've had a revolution, or you've become independent, or you're a sort of colonial state settling down. On the other hand, that analysis can lead us to a position where it feels like the chance of the United Kingdom finding a new basis depends entirely on whether the people of Scotland vote for independence or not, in a process in which nobody else is involved. So a question to come back to Nick and then to Carwyn is there, we've heard from the Labour point of view and the Constitutional Convention, but is there more that can be done, if you like, to get control of the political agenda, so the debate does become a union-wide agenda without, there may have to be a Scottish referendum, but without it being determined by the outcome of a Scottish referendum? Nick?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and it relates to one that I think Martin Kettle has asked in the chat, which is, what happens in all of these discussions without the Conservative Party? And in our history, because the Conservative Party has been such a successful political party, its attitude to questions of constitutional change has been profoundly important. It was before the First World War in respect of Ireland, and it was in the 1970s and so on. So one question about these issues, I suppose, is, how does liberal left opinion and, broadly speaking, progressive opinion start to kind of engage with conservative views, whether they're in the Conservative Party or more small c conservative? And clearly there will be ministers in this current government who will be thinking about what to do if the SNP wins a majority and calls for another referendum. and there'll be voices like those of George Osborne in the Evening Standard the other day saying Boris Johnson just has to say no second referendum. That's the end of it. Otherwise, you know, the risks are too great. There'll be others who say, no, we need to make the case for the union much more forcefully. And there'll be others who say, actually, it doesn't matter if the union collapses, that actually, you know, we can be sanguine about that prospect. And one of the questions, I think, for politicians and others engaging on these issues is, how do they begin to understand, interpret, and work with those different forms of conservative views? And what do they mean for reform? And in truth, I suspect that any conservative government and party will be relatively minimalist about these things. It will not want radical constitutional change. It's never favoured written constitutions. It's never favoured settlements that undermine the existing distribution of power, and therefore, you know, the idea that there's a sort of political mobilisation of a conversation in England and other parts of the union outside Scotland, it has to run through an engagement with that conservative opinion, but in ways that at the moment look, you know, like they can be very hard to achieve. The alternative is you get the election of a Labour government that just decides it's going to do these things. But, you know, again, we saw in 1997 that it could produce lots of radical change, but does it produce a process where the nation or multi-nations of the UK can move forward together? Thank you.
Carwyn, how would you set the agenda?
Yeah, thanks, John. I think, well, first of all, I wouldn't say that there is a blanket view in the Conservative Party against change. What surprised me was, you know, I've spoken to some who were, you know, pretty strong Brexiteers, people who I would have, you know, immediately thought of as being in quite an English nationalist camp in terms of their thinking, who are actually very open to the idea of constitutional change. You know, I'd misread them, frankly, I'll admit that, and I've been quite surprised at those who I regarded as, you know, real old-style nationalists from the British sense are actually open to this. I think it varies. I mean, Wales, for example, the Welsh Conservative Party has got a strong anti-devolution element in it because they can't win elections. So if you can't win an election to run the government, let's just get rid of the institution. There's that element of it. But I think there are openings within the Conservative Party. I don't think the Conservative Party is monolithic in terms of its view. And in terms of the stakes here, well, yes, it was because of the actions of Conservatives and Liberal Unionists that Ireland went from being a country that would have been content with devolution to a country that ended up in a war, both against the British state and in a civil war, and subsequently becoming a republic. If Home Rule had been delivered to Ireland, you know, before the beginning of the First World War, it's quite possible Ireland would still be part of the UK. Now, the question for us then is, what happens with Scotland? You can't keep on saying to people, when they keep on voting for a party that's in favour of a referendum, you can't have it. That's a recipe for trouble. You know, nobody wants to see that happen, but that's a recipe for conflict at the end of the day. People I'm just going to go away and say, all right, then, but that's not going to happen. And you then have voices who are far more hardline, who come forward and say, well, if they're not going to give us a referendum, perhaps we need to fight for it. In Northern Ireland, it gives us an example of where that can happen, although, of course, the history is different. So it's not simply a question of saying, you can't have it, tough luck. You know, you can't have, for example, a Conservative Party saying, we were elected in 2015 and a manifesto promised to have a Brexit referendum, and that promise was delivered, and then say to an SNP government elected on a promise of having a referendum in Scotland, no, you can't have that. That's just double standards, and that's not going to work in the longer term. And there's one small point at the end, and Nick raised very properly the issue of, you know, what does identity look like? You know, I have never gone abroad and said to people when I'm asked my nationality that I'm British, because people think you're English. And it takes some explaining, right? When you say Wales, quite often you get blank stares, blank looks, but the Euros in 2016 were marvellous in that regard, because I now live in a country called Wales, Gareth Bale, which is far easier to explain to people. But that's my primary identity. Yeah, that's not a conflict for me. It doesn't mean I'm hostile to Britishness. But my wife, and you know, I know her view, and she'd be happy with me saying this, but she'll never feel British, not ever. She's a Belfast Catholic, and she would never, ever, ever feel British in any way, shape, or form. You know, when you're told as a child never to go into areas where there are Union Jacks flying because they're dangerous, that kind of has an effect on you. And the one thing that's left in my family, annoyingly for me, is that the other 3 members of this family have Irish passports and I don't. Why I tried with the Irish government, but it's never quite worked out. But it shows that if we're talking about creating a new British identity, in some ways, it has to be a functional identity, a practical functional identity, rather than an emotional one, because those days are gone.
Let's pick up from there. So given that an Irish passport now has much more practical significance than it did 4 weeks ago, what about Northern Ireland in this discussion? Quite a few people have raised in the questions that, you can have a discussion. You talk about Northern Ireland because it's one of the 4 parts of the United Kingdom, but as Nick said earlier on, it's very different circumstances, very different situation and political history. So how do we engage Northern Ireland in this discussion about the future of the Union? Could I go to Nicola first on that for some thoughts, then Nick and Carwyn?
Yeah, it's been really interesting over the last year in particular, where this discourse of the 4 nations has emerged, and even Boris Johnson seems very comfortable talking about the 4 nations. And the idea of describing Northern Ireland as a nation is obviously quite problematic, because it's a territory where nationhood is disputed and where different feelings of national identity are clearly in evidence. I think it's very difficult. I think Northern Ireland is engaged in its own conversation. It doesn't have an easy outcome. There is a constitutional process, unlike in the case of Scotland. The Good Friday Agreement, Belfast Agreement, whichever terminology you want to use, and the legislation that flowed from it does provide for a border poll, albeit that the process that would trigger that is very ambiguous still. There is at least a recognition of the prospect of reunification, but that in itself wouldn't be an end, because that would create a different set of issues and a different set of challenges in accommodating minorities in whichever state structure. So I don't think you involve Northern Ireland without seeing it in an all island, in a these islands perspective, because I think the place and the role of Ireland and the sense of attachment that many within Northern Ireland have to Ireland has to also be part of that story. And maybe that is one way around this, is to not think of this just as a British exercise in a way of saving the Union or saving Britain, but to think about how the territories of these islands will continue to work together, whichever their constitutional future, because in the context of dealing with a global pandemic, or in the context of dealing with big issues of climate change, well, it doesn't really matter what the constitutional outcome is or what the constitutional framework is. The territories and the governments that lead them will still have to coordinate and communicate and work together in some shape or form. So I think maybe broadening the perspective is one way to bring Northern Ireland into it in a way that isn't going to alienate a substantial section of the population.
Thank you. Nick.
Yeah, it is a very important but difficult question, and for the reasons you've given John and Nicola has just described. I mean, obviously in a sense, the story of the recent history of Northern Ireland is one of creative flexibility about political evolution and change. Secured obviously the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, but subsequently, which took place within the context of the European Union, and Brexit's obviously changed that. You know, we now have an international withdrawal agreement which has a Northern Ireland Protocol, so we have that legal document. We have the Good Friday Agreement itself, and as Nicola said, provision in that for a border poll on reunification, which of course means that, you know, you have a certain part of your population which has a sort of the right to secede from any federal union in its own political settlement. So I suppose that, you know, just being very political about this, you know, the key thing is not to disturb those arrangements in ways that threaten peace, that can't gain consent, that will abrogate our obligations internationally to the Republic of Ireland and the European Union. And that would mean, I think, that some of the kinds of proposals we've been discussing for a more of a federal or quasi-federal United Kingdom have to proceed incredibly carefully when it comes to anything that disturbs the settlement in Northern Ireland. But you can imagine, for example, that if we had a Senate rather than a House of Lords, that it would be possible to find the place for Northern Ireland within that Senate, just as it was that Northern Ireland returned MEPs to the European Parliament and returns MPs to the Westminster Parliament. The fiscal settlement is possible to reform, embracing Northern Ireland dispute resolution, even codification of rights and so on. Those things are, I think, amenable to change. It's just that in the context of Northern Ireland, they have to be done so against a set of obligations and political realities, which are very, very different for those for the rest of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Sorry, Carwyn, did you want to add anything on this? Or?
I agree with what Nick has said.
Yeah.
Northern Ireland is inevitably complicated, but the biggest shock, of course, to Northern Ireland would be Scottish independence.
Right.
That takes away a chunk of unionist identity, because so much of it is linked with Scotland rather than with England in terms of its unionism, and that what effect that would have is difficult to predict.
Okay, I'd like to ask Nick in particular now about the central union state. I mean, it's come up in this conversation in Carwyn's description of dealing with the Treasury, but there are an awful lot of questions in the Q&A about English devolution. And of course, it is essentially the Whitehall state that is most resistant to English devolution. And what we've seen over the last 20 years at best is what some people call elite co-option, where you get local council leaders and businesses and others to deliver Whitehall priorities. So the question I think I wanted to raise here is the reform of the union state and challenging its centralized power, is it an integral part of this constitutional process, or is it something that's going to have to be dealt with differently if we want to see devolution in England? I mean, if you took the view, for example, that devolution in England would be a good thing, even if it wasn't as part of the formation of an English national system of governance and all the rest of it, so is this an internal process to be dealt with in England with the union state, or do we have to make reform of the union state part of this constitutional process?
Sorry, John, was that to me?
Yes, if you don't mind, yes.
Yeah. So I think...
with you anyway.
Yeah, no, sure. So I think there will be some contradictory processes here. I mean, I would not be surprised that the COVID pandemic led to more calls for centralisation, despite all the problems we've had in central government, and actually the really innovative response we've had from local authorities, and of course, as Rachel was mentioning, the kind of demands for greater power and responsibility and respect from Whitehall that Andy Burnham and others have been arguing. But I do think, and one of the lessons from the Scottish referendum on independence in 2014 was it's very difficult to, as it were, insulate England from the debates that take place in Scotland. So, of course, it was immediately after Scotland voted to stay in the Union that David Cameron then announced English votes for English laws, and that process then took place. And I certainly think that if we are to address this question of England's place in the Union, and if the answer that we've had from royal commissions and from many proponents in recent years of these kinds of reforms, that English regions should be the equivalent, and I think some people in the questions have raised this too, should be the equivalent unit, as it were, in a federation with Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, that if you're going to contest and challenge that and have a different answer about England, then you've got to address this question of its powers and the union state and how it relates to England's place in the union and then devolution within England itself. Obviously, one of the big lessons of the Labour period in office was that the kind of pressures for change that led to devolution to Wales and Scotland that preceded the election of the Blair government, the Constitutional Convention in Scotland and so on, those kinds of processes had not taken place in England in the same way, and the pressure for local devolution that had been mobilised in civil society with politicians and others wasn't there. It's an open question whether it is now, and I think there are signs that it is. and the kind of messy asymmetric devolution we've got at the moment with English metro mayors and others may lead in time to sort of force itself into this conversation in ways that weren't perhaps true in the post-1997 period. But I do think that, you know, and I know you share this view, John, I do think that, you know, a lesson is that the English regions did not have any enduring status for the English people, that their identity, history, forms of political attachment were insufficient, and it was very easy for the incoming Conservative government to abolish RDAs and to put that regional level of government to one side. So it can't be that answer, in my view.
Carwyn, in your model, I mean, you described your problems with the Treasury, but in your model for the foreseeable future, it will be English resources and primarily Southeast England and Eastern England and London resources that provide the financial underpinning for the union. And my view is England has to accept that if you want to continue a union for the foreseeable future. But how do you restructure the financial parts of the state in the model of your equivalent national parliaments and sovereign states that you put forward, given that financial asymmetry?
Well, you have to make the process subject to rules, and there are no rules at the moment. The Treasury can do whatever it wants, and it's obscure. It's not clear how they take the decisions. They can ignore the Barnett formula when they want, in the same way as the UK government ignores the Sewell Convention if it's expedient to do so. That's part of the problem. How would you do it? Well, you look at other countries. Look at Germany, for example, where you've got a fiscal devolution. We've got that already. But there's also an understanding that there is a set of rules in place that governs how the Treasury takes decisions, rather than the lawless situation that we have at the moment. So if you have a constitutional framework that determines the decision-making process for how money is to be distributed, I mean, you don't put a formula in the Constitution, but at least you've got a set of rules then that people can understand in terms of how money is distributed and how it goes. Now, you know, one of the issues, you're quite right, John, I mean, people say, well, England is the cash cow of the UK. Well, London, actually. London and the southeast of England, they're the main financial drivers of the UK. And you know, London and the southeast of England could be a very, very prosperous independent state if it so chose. But if we accept the idea of a union, and people have, if we accept the idea that a hugely important part of that union is a fiscal and monetary union, so not just a common currency, but the redistribution. This is the problem with the euro, isn't it? It's a monetary union, not a fiscal union, but a mechanism for redistributing money to where it's needed on a fair and transparent basis, which it isn't at the moment, he said, from a Welsh perspective. Yeah. Then I think you've got greater clarity, and I think that creates greater trust in the system as well.
Okay. And Nicola, from a Scottish point of view, where you're working, one of the great untouchables in the unionist case has always been the Barnett formula, which is not satisfactory for Wales, and at a more popular level amongst people who've never heard of the Barnett formula, real resentment about free prescriptions and other things which are on offer in Scotland. How
and Wales.
And Wales, yes, indeed.
First.
Yes, it's funny. My experience is that people seem to moan much more about it happening in Scotland than in Wales, but that must be just the people I meet. But in going forward in Scotland, is there any way for a union debate to take place of the sort that we've been talking about, which doesn't immediately hit the buffers of that will mean changing the Barnett formula?
I think there probably is. In the Barnett formula, in effect, has been changed, or its effects have been changed quite a bit anyway through the fiscal framework and through the partial autonomy of tax raising powers. And I mean, there was in 2016, there was a substantial increase in the fiscal autonomy of the Scottish Parliament, but in a way that I suspect is quite problematic because so much emphasis now is put on one tax alone, and that's income tax. And it's not even income tax devolution, it's devolution of the responsibility for setting the rates and the thresholds, but within an overall tax framework that is reserved to the UK Parliament. So you don't, I think it's I'm not an economist, but it seems to me to be quite problematic to have such a reliance on one tax without the basket of options that you might otherwise have with that. So I think there is, I mean, there is a review of the fiscal framework due quite soon, I would have thought anyway, so it's entirely possible for these issues to come up. I think there would be wariness within the current climate, not least with what appears to be happening with the Shared Prosperity Fund, which is a centralisation of resource and spending power, and stemming from the powers that UK government gave to itself to spend in devolved areas. So I think it's difficult to have a debate that could have buy-in from everybody unless you address the wider issues that are on the table as well. Can I just go back briefly to the questions that Nick was raising about the English question and the governance of England? And it also came up in the chat a bit about the role of citizens' assemblies. I had some experience of this as a member of the stewarding group for the Citizens' Assembly of Scotland that's just completed. And I would love to see a citizens' assembly in England to explore issues around how England could be or should be governed. And I think we're past the stage now, we're past the era now where it's okay for all of this to be dealt with in an elite level or even a political party level. I think it does need much wider deliberation and much wider buy-in from you know, a representative body of the people.
Thank you very much. And I'll echo that point, because I get quite frustrated by a line of argument where English voters in polls are given 5 options for running England, and not surprisingly, none of those, apart from English votes and English laws, produces an absolute majority. And people say, well, there you are, they don't really want change. But actually, if you actually analyse the polls correctly, it shows that most people want change. It's just there hasn't been a debate yet that allows a settled view of how England should be governed to emerge. So I very much hope that some sort of English discussion takes place. I want to go on now for what I think I'll make the last question. And apologies to people. I hope we've raised most of the issues here that we're clearly going to need to run another event specifically about England, because we can't deal with all the English devolutionary questions. So I acknowledge that. I promise that will be coming down the line very shortly from the Centre for English Identity and Politics. But we'll obviously capture all of this in our when we write up the event. It's really going back to a point that I think it was Nicola raised at the beginning, which is one of consent. And it has been raised in the Q&A. What does consent look like? Is it, I mean, at the moment, consent would be taken to be the Westminster Parliament saying we've had a look at the issues and we've decided what to do. Referendum were established by the Blair government as the normal thing you do if you're going to have a constitutional change. So are we looking for a consent to the union that has a series of referenda in each nation, or a union-wide referendum? Or do you have the sort of consultative process which one could imagine that sort of legitimates the outcome, even if there's not a formal popular decision? My sense, if you have sovereign nations, then the sovereignty actually has to lie with the people, which raises a number of questions about the monarchy, which we won't go into now. But how does consent look in the sort of changes broad, assuming for the moment we're looking somewhere in Carwyn's worldview here, not saying that everybody on the panel signs up to that, but assuming we were in that role, what would consent look like? Nick, I'll start with you, then I'll go to Nicola, and then Carwyn. I'm going to invite you to answer that question, but perhaps if you would respond to the overall discussion, because you've got us going so well. Nick.
Yeah, so I think if we are in Carwyn's world and we're not in the world of sort of incremental change that takes place in Westminster in negotiation between.
Actually, Nick, I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to say, because you put what I would call, what I've always advocated, strategic incrementalism, a series of changes that leads in a direction. But so I'm going to press you to answer that question too. Suppose you did, you know, a reformed House of Lords. Suppose you had a full form of English votes and English laws, bits of English devolution. In your model of change, is there a consent process there at all, or do you just do something, hope it works, and move on to the next thing? So I'm going to challenge your approach as well as Carwyn's, perhaps.
Yes, well, I mean, I would like to see a written constitution, and I'm in favour of a more radical process of reform than perhaps is implied by my reference to strategic incrementalism. I was simply, the realist in me was just thinking about ways in which change might happen plausibly. I think if you do have more radical change, then the model that we've seen emerge in places like the Republic of Ireland and elsewhere is to try to combine deliberative processes through citizens' assemblies, the kind of things that Nicola was talking about, with referenda to as it were, gain wider public support for a big change, and then the legislative change that needs to follow it. And that process then means that you link both the deliberation with the direct referenda with the formal legal change of representative democracy. So if we were in the realm of radicalism, it would be that. If we were not, if we were moving much more incrementally, obviously, this takes place against the backdrop of the Scots asking for another referendum. But if we were to move more incrementally, I think it's possible to have a reform of the House of Lords without a referendum. I think as you start to widen this out towards the codification of these changes in the Constitution, then I think you do get closer to needing some kind of popular referendum. But if we want that referendum to be one that is genuinely securing the informed consent of the different peoples of the nations of the United Kingdom, then it has to be conducted in a way that builds in much more deliberative elements to it. If it's like the Brexit referendum, then I think it won't secure the deeper popular legitimacy you need if you're really seeking to refound the constitution of your state. That would be my main argument.
Nicola?
I agree with all of that. And I would just add, I suppose that the lesson from the 2014 independence referendum is that a referendum by itself can be deliberative. Now, I know that that was a very painful experience for some, but it was a deliberative exercise. I mean, I know that from the engagement that I and my colleagues had in the process, and there was a lot of public engagement, there was a lot of learning, as much as was possible with what is inevitably an uncertain future anyway. But I also think it's incumbent on the alternatives that are put forward in a referendum to be explained. And that, to some extent, happened in 2014. It didn't happen in 2016. And so we were left with the sort of long-running exploration of what Brexit means Brexit actually was ever going to mean. So I do think it's important that before the decision takes place, that there is a clear sense of what we are talking about, what the outcome might look like. Now, that doesn't mean legislation before a referendum, because that raises other issues and other problems, but something more substantial within the context of a deliberative debate. Now, I think the problem, though, with having an idea of a referendum for the whole of the UK for a whole new UK constitutional framework is that it has to recognise the UK as a plurinational state. So you would need to have consent in the different territories that make up the UK. It wouldn't be sufficient to secure the future of the state if you're using the overwhelming majority of one territory within it to represent consent for the whole.
Thank you. Carwyn.
I think Nicola is right. This would have to be ratified by the people. I think it would have to be done on a per nation or per territory basis. I mean, for example, very difficult to see, if GB voted one way and Northern Ireland voted another, how that would be stable. Of course, there is then the question of what if 3 vote in favour and 1 votes against? What happens then? That's a question we can't answer today. How would the process work? First of all, I'm not somebody who sees a Royal Commission approach, an elite approach, as being the one that's suitable. It has to be a broad approach involving as many people as possible. But a referendum would have to be on a particular package. I think the problem with multi-question referendums is that people don't often know really what questions they're being asked. It has to be made fairly clear to people. One of the great messages of the Brexit referendum was take back control. You couldn't want an easier slogan, and that resonated. We had a referendum was in 2011 on primary powers. Now, the actual question on the referendum ballot paper was 3 paragraphs long. and it mentioned Schedule 7 of the Government of Wales Act, and it had to be that way, because legally the question had to be that way. But I just said, look, this is one simple question. Do you believe that all the laws that only affect Wales should be made in Wales? Full stop, that's it. And we won, almost 2-1 on that basis. So I think it's a question of getting together a package that most people are agreed on, and then thinking about how that can be explained to people, because most people are not interested in the Constitution, sadly for us, and the way it operates. They need to just have a strapline that explains what exactly they're being asked to vote for or against. We're a long way from that, and I'm afraid the worry that I have is that much of the discussion to get today might not even be relevant in a few years' time, because Scotland will have gone. And this discussion should have taken place, at least 5 or 6 years ago, or maybe beyond that. We're having a conversation because we're facing an existential challenge. That's part of the problem. One of my great worries in 2014, and England is ignored in the conversation quite often, is if Scotland had left, what happened to the rest of the UK? What do you call it for a start? You can't call it Britain, because Northern Britain, as expressed by Scotland, would have gone. What is it? The United Kingdom of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Okay. What do you call the citizens of that nation? What are they? Unis? England, Wales, Northern Ireland? I don't know. What's the flag? You can't have a flag where, you've got 3 nations, one of which is mainly not in the UK. The other one has completely left the UK, and the other nation isn't represented on the flag in the first place. I don't think it would have been stable. And there's another issue that I think we would have faced in 2014, which is still there without some kind of managed change, and that's the issue of English identity. If Scotland had gone, I think you're right, John, people tend, the annoyance people express with what happens outside England tends to be expressed in terms of what happens in Scotland. No one seems to notice what happens in Wales. And I could have seen with Scotland gone the rise of people in England saying, we want an independent England. England can leave the UK. There's nothing to stop England leaving the UK. And you could have seen, something utterly implausible, which we would have thought utterly implausible not a decade beforehand, starting to grow as people said, oh, if we weren't stuck with Wales, all they do is take our money. If we weren't stuck with Northern Ireland, they're just trouble. People in England would have more money. There'd be more money for people in England. Look at the money we could save if we weren't subsidising Wales and Northern Ireland. Let's have an independent England. And that was an issue, that Peter Robinson and myself discussing this thing, it seemed so unlikely, but then the more you thought about it, the more you started to worry about it. And this is where the stakes are high. And I'll just end with the point that Nick made about, it's profound change that usually causes the creation of a new constitution. And he's right, of course. Usually it is, a declaration of independence or civil war, conflict, absolutely right. But what we're facing here is not violence, a violent civil war, but we are facing the impending possible collapse of the UK. And so being able to take a, as it were, preemptive position and to be able to offer something now, even though it may still be too late, but to be able to offer something now is designed to stave off any kind of problems in the future. So, yeah, we're not fortunately facing violence. We haven't come out of a history of violence, but we are facing huge challenges, the greatest challenges ever to the existence of the UK state.
Carwyn, thank you very much indeed. And to Nick and to Nicola, I think that's been a fantastic webinar. I'm grateful for all the people who stayed with us. I think just to close it, the enduring legacy of this discussion, I think, is that the political strategies to get this discussion on the agenda is actually the most important question that we face beyond the detail of what the future looks like, because as Carwyn says, we will otherwise lose control of events on a debate that could have happened earlier. Please look out for other events at the Centre for English Identity and Politics, and those who've registered for this one will obviously get notified about those, and we'll hope to upload this to the video up to the website by the end of next week. But to our speakers and to the participants, to all the people who asked questions, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.